Hello, and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. Last episode, we discussed the aftermath of the fall of Quebec and what that meant for the French and their Indigenous allies. The direct response was Pontiac's War and the Treaty of Fort Niagara, which brought the former French outposts under British occupation and asserted British sovereignty over North America from the ocean to the Mississippi, with some various Indigenous nations to have authority over lands between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi, provided they recognized the sovereignty of London over those lands. The next step to ensure a stable peace between the Crown and what was called the Indian Reserve, which evoked the maxim that good neighbors made good fences, and set up a system to ensure that there wouldn't be any later encroachments. This was done in Pennsylvania and New York State by building new and reinforcing existing forts, and on the St. Lawrence by fortifying Montreal. While the English Crown asserted no intention of moving into the reserve territory, the same could not be said for the English settlers themselves in the colonies. Small groups of settlers were constantly pushing westward into the reserve, endangering the peace. The settlers would claim that they were moving into unoccupied land, as the Miami, the Shawnee, the Wyandot were not settled farmers on every inch of the Ohio River Valley. The situation was not as precarious on the Ottawa River Valley. The Crown had tried to incentivize settlement of English Protestants into Quebec to expand their New England mission into the new territories, but they hadn't been as successful as hoped for the past 15 years. Settlers from New England came to the Maritimes, where there were already commercial and cultural ties with the older English colonies. But the St. Lawrence remained predominantly French and Catholic, and settlers were simply not coming. There were many reasons why the habitants from the St. Lawrence didn't want to up and move westward, in the fashion of their New England opposite members. The first was the fear that they must stay, otherwise their families' lands would be expropriated and given to the minority English Protestant settlers. The second was that because Catholics were by definition not members of the Church of England, they were forbidden to take the loyalty oaths to the king as the head of the Church, and hence forbidden from holding office or acquiring new land by purchase or grant. The situation in 1774 was very similar to where it had been in 1759 for the St. Lawrence colonies. The maritime provinces were receiving settlers and becoming gradually more English and more Protestant. But this was not happening in Quebec and Montreal, despite the best efforts of the governors general. The response of the Crown was the Quebec Act of 1774, which created a legal structure for the frontier designed to limit colonial expansion and create a workable, stable situation on the St. Lawrence that would foster a movement forward instead of the stagnation that the region was experiencing. Before we talk about the act itself, let's take a minute to talk about what was meant by the word Quebec. Much like when we were talking about the Illinois and the Ohio in our last episode, and I had to mention that the Illinois country is not the same as the state of Illinois, the same applies to the province of Quebec. Today, the province of Quebec includes the eastern shores of Hudson Bay. In 1774, it did not. It did, however, include Labrador, southern Ontario, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and swaths of modern-day Wisconsin, Illinois, and Minnesota. It also included the so-called Land of the Indians, which was under royal suzerainty. Of all this land, about 75% of the European population lived within walking distance of the St. Lawrence between Montreal and Saguenay. This was the province of Quebec in 1774, under the Constitution Act of 1791, so through the American War of Independence. The Quebec Act was the brainchild of Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General for England and Wales, but the local advisor, supporter, and implementer of the Act was some guy named Carleton. Check that. Sir Guy Carleton. Carleton was born in Strabane, Ireland, the son of Ulster plantation owner Lancelot Carleton. Like many second and third sons, he and his younger brother Thomas joined the army as their older brother, also called Lancelot, was set to inherit the wealth of the family farm. I'm including that biographical trivia about Ireland for a reason. He was of an Anglo-Protestant ascendancy class that ruled over Irish Catholic peasants, typically with minimal thought to the culture and history of the natives. Carleton would serve under Wolfe at the fall of Quebec and eventually become the governor of Quebec from 1768 to 1778 and again from 1785 to 1795, where he would be a member of an Anglo-Protestant ascendancy class, this time ruling over French Catholic peasants. One would think that his instinct would be to try to recreate the Irish model of exploitation, but by all accounts, Carleton was self-aware enough to understand that the Irish model sowed the seeds of its own violent resistance. Though, truth be told, British Ireland would continue on for another 167 years, until 1921. Carleton spent his tenure as Governor of Quebec and Governor-General of British North America building a political structure that would cement Quebec into the empire, culturally, economically, and socially. His goal was very much integration rather than assimilation. To this end, he courted buy-in from local leadership and planned on developing a legal framework for society to function in a manner comfortable enough to avoid having the population reject the English leadership class. The first issue addressed by the Act was the issue of religious rights of the Catholic majority. In Carleton's native Ireland, the Catholic Church was infamously suborned to the Protestant, and it would have been easy to assume that Carleton would bring that model across the ocean with him. Already in Quebec, like Ireland, Catholics were denied voting, holding a public office, and practicing their faith openly, as well as practicing law or medicine. Owning land was allowed for those who owned land prior to the conquest, but buying land afterwards was administratively burdensome, though not outright illegal, just very rare. The Bishop of Quebec, Henri-Marie de Breuil de Pontbriand, was allowed to stay on as bishop after the conquest, but he had died a year later in 1760 at the ripe old age of 52, and no replacement was allowed for 6 years. Abiding by the conditions of surrender of Quebec in 1759, the religion was not illegal per se, and the churches were not closed and financially liquidated, but no reasonable person would claim that there was religious freedom to any serious degree. The first step of the Quebec Act to adjust this situation was to adjust the oath of loyalty sworn by all public officials. No longer would they swear loyalty to the rightful heirs of Elizabeth I as the sovereign head of state and head of the church, but to George III directly as the king. Catholics, and Jews for that matter, would now own land, practice professions, bear witness in trial, serve on a jury, and enjoy the rights of being a British subject, in theory at least. For that to normalize in practice would take longer, but this was definitely a step in the right direction. The second change instituted by the Quebec Act was a reversal of the property ownership system. Prior to the conquest, Nouvelle-France divided land in a seigneurial or manor system. The British tried to institute a township system. The Quebec Act returned the earlier system of property tenure. The seigneurial system was based on the feudal system of France at the time and involved a devolution of custodianship from the Crown to the Company of 100 Associates, La Compagnie de Nouvelle-France, from them to local landlords, who then devolved the authority to tenant farmers. The territory was sold or leased from the French crown to the company, then the landlord, called a seigneur, who in turn owed the crown, through the company, an agreed-upon amount of lumber, grain, fur, or any other payment. This was before a cash economy was a practical alternative to barter. The seigneur would then subdivide their land into long strips fronting on the river. These subdivisions were then leased to free farmers, who would be given contracts in perpetuity for the land if they could provide an agreed-upon rent to the seigneur. Riverboats would bring goods to market in Quebec, Trois-Rivières, or Montreal. These farmers, called habitants, would then pay the landlords, who would then pay the company, who would then pay the crown. While I've called this a feudal system, it was not feudal in one important sense. Habitants were free. They were not bound to the land, and if they wanted to give up their plot of land that they've been working on for the landlord, they were free to do so. Medieval peasants did not have this liberty. The reciprocal expectations of this semi-feudalism were fairly minimal. Landlords would be expected to build a mill and secure access to water. Habitants would be expected to clear the land, pay the tax, and give a certain number of days' labor to the landlord. These habitant fiefs were held by the farmers themselves, so could not be independently divided among the sons of the farmer at his time of death. So second sons would join the clergy if they could afford it, or the military if they couldn't. Some would become coureurs de bois, but there was no free land for settlement, as all of New France was accounted for, even if unoccupied by the French, and settling outside of New France, in the lands of the Anishinaabe or other allied nations, would risk violence from the indigenous inhabitants or their fellow Frenchmen for endangering the peace. Conversely, the English township system involved much stronger commitments by the landlords and a municipal council for building infrastructure. They were not expected to simply sit back and collect revenue, but would be expected to build roads and a market, church, and other commitments depending on where and when the township was allotted. Within a township, or a regional municipality, land use was focused on selling or granting land to independent farmers, who would then own the land in freehold. Tenants were less common. In Quebec, these townships were called cantons. The Quebec Act reinstituted the seigneurial system, reinforcing the power of local landlords and clergy. Many of the manors were owned by religious organizations through a patronage grant system, and they collected rents from farmers. The Act also entrenched one of Quebec City's conditions of surrender, in that French civil code would be restored completely for all matters pertaining to property and civil rights. English law would take precedence in cases of criminal justice, public law, and wills and testaments. Now, laws in general are typically created by legislatures. This is true for today's Parliament, as well as the legislatures of the English colonies. Legislatures were typically elected by landowning men. Of course they were men. Of course they were white men. Of course they were Protestant. Because legislators needed to swear the oath of loyalty. The Crown had assumed that Anglo-Protestants would flock to Quebec, but they didn't. The economy was weaker, and the environment harsher than the southern colonies. Land was not ripe for the taking, but would need to be purchased at a high cost. The infrastructure for bringing materials to market was not developed. Quebec was simply not as appealing to potential immigrants as Maryland or New Hampshire. This created a fear that by extending legal and civil rights to the French Catholic population, this meant that there could be a legislature that was not invested in the rest of the empire, economically, socially, religiously, or culturally. The decision was made to forego an assembly, and instead there would be a legislative council of 23 who would be appointed by and advise the governor. Governor Carleton used this legislative council to secure the support of French Catholic landlords, clergy, and merchants. The act was not popular with the British merchants in Quebec City and Montreal. At the time of the act's passing by Parliament in Westminster, the English represented a statistical margin of the population, but a high social status, and this was to be a lure for future English migration to the province. Members of the Anglo-Protestant ascendancy feared that rather than assimilating the colony into the imperial economy and culture, the act would entrench the difference in the province and make it difficult for future integration. Also, on a more practical level, the laws of commerce within the province were from the French Civil Code and would require the advice of French lawyers rather than just the experts in English civil law that would be needed to trade anywhere else in the empire. Those fears were assuaged by the geographic expansion of the colony, extending the reach of the merchants into the center of the continent. While the fur trade was not as lucrative as it had once been, it was still large enough that fortunes were ready to be made, and Quebec, as defined by the Quebec Act, was rich in furs, lumber, and undiscovered mining resources. From our examination of it so far, it was an imperfect law which took some positive steps on the issue of civil rights for a minority population. Within the St. Lawrence, Catholics represented 98% of the population, so calling them a minority may seem a bit strange, but within the Empire they were a statistical minority. There were only about 90,000 Catholics and less than 1,000 Protestants in all of Quebec, but that population was smaller than Massachusetts Bay, which was home to 268,627 souls in 1774. Why was this act, one focused on the St. Lawrence settlements, considered to be one of the Intolerable Acts, an act so heinous, so violently authoritarian, that the colonists of the future United States would list this as a justification for the War of Independence that would take 30,000 lives? Did it really deserve to be listed alongside the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Boston Port Act, and the Massachusetts Governing Act? I think no. It was just included with the Intolerable Acts because the timing coincided with the other acts. People were ready to take offense at just about anything by that point. The future second president of the United States, John Adams, stated that the act was dangerous to the interests of the Protestant religion and of these colonies. Allowing standing for Catholics was interpreted by the newspapers in Boston and New York and Philadelphia as giving Catholics dominance over Protestants. Given the population disparity between the two, I suppose there would be some validity to that if they were electing by one man, one vote, but they weren't. And to a modern ear, this sounds like the conspiracy talk of fundamentalists. Anti-papism at the time was a fact of life in the colonies, and it should not be forgotten that the American ideal of religious liberty was intended as religious liberty for Protestants to not be governed by non-Protestants. Anti-papism at this time was a fact of life in the colonies, and it should not be forgotten that the American ideal of religious liberty was intended as religious liberty for Protestants to not be governed by non-Protestants, ever. The wall of separation between church and state was coined by Thomas Jefferson in 1802 to assure the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, that they would be physically and financially safe from the Congregationalists of Connecticut, who outnumbered them in their assembly. Catholics, Jews, followers of the religious traditions among the indigenous or enslaved Africans were not considered part of that liberty. In the American Declaration of Independence, the Quebec Act was cited as one of the 27 grievances that forced the hand of rebellion. Quoting from about 2/3 of the way down the Declaration, listing the item as, "for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rules into these colonies." By enlarging the boundaries of Quebec and putting into statute the Indian Reserve boundary, boxing in the expansion of the 13 colonies, the Crown was seen as having committed an unforgivable attempt at containment of the colonies. The colonies were planning on expanding into the Indian country with or without the support of the Crown at this point. And history would show that they would do just that, without shame or modesty, once they were free from London's yoke. The significance of the Quebec Act locally is that the Ottawa Valley, as part of the province of Quebec, was to remain under the stewardship of the Algonquin people for now, and the Crown intended to maintain that status quo. Again, for now. Algonquin and Odawa would still visit Montreal for trading, and fur trappers, surveyors, merchants, and missionaries, though now Protestant ones, would come down the river, but it seemed as though there was a peaceful equilibrium accomplished for this moment in time. It would last through the American War of Independence from 1775 to 1783, but would not survive the peace afterwards. Thank you for listening to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. In our next episode, we'll take a look at the revolution next door and see how that had an indelible change on what is now Canada, particularly the Ottawa area. This podcast is written, recorded, and produced by me, Brendan Ray. We are getting closer to the more local podcast that I'd envisioned when I started writing this background. So thank you for your patience. In the meantime, please take a minute to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get these podcasts. If you could take a minute to write a review, that would be even better. Please follow us on Facebook and Blue Sky at the Ottawa History Hub podcast, or on X Twitter at OttHistoryHub. That's OttHistoryHub. Take care, everybody. Advance Ottawa. En avant!